I'm John D. Widiak, and joining me today is Ed Gardner, and today is November 16th, 2008. And I'd really like to thank you for coming today and just sharing your history.
You're most welcome.
You were just telling me, just before we got on camera, that you were born right in Sykesville.
Yes, I did.
And you were born in a house, right?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about just what you remember about your folks talking about it or anything like that, what time you were born, what was that like?
I think it was a surprise to the community because my mother was strictly a housewife and didn't go out much. I was the youngest in a family of 6, but there's 10 years between my sister and myself, and even my siblings didn't realize that my mother was expecting a child.
Oh, really?
And when they came home from school,
you were there.
My mother they couldn't understand why my mother was in bed, and when they went up and checked on her, and she pulled down the covers, and there was a new baby brother.
Oh my, is that right?
So, yeah, and we spanned. My oldest sister was 18, and my youngest sister was 10, and so.
Now, are they all living pretty much in the area too, or?
They're all deceased but one.
All deceased but one.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have one sister that lives in Carroll Lutheran Village here in Westminster.
All right. Now, tell me a little bit about when you were a small child. Even can you remember before you actually started school, or?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
What was it like being a small child in a small town like Sykesville?
It was fantastic. Because of the time period, I wandered all over town when I was barefooted in training pants. I mean, my mother hardly ever knew where I was. It wasn't a strange thing for a woman to call and say, Eddie's going to take his nap with me today. He's visiting, and I would be maybe 2 or 3 blocks away. Because there was no traffic, the kids played on the streets.
This is when you were like a toddler.
Absolutely,
yes.
Be
darn.
And of course, with the age difference, when I started school, of course, as another thing that's hardly heard of now, I went all 12 grades in the same building. And with the difference in my sister and my age, she was a senior the year I started to school. We walked to school together 1 year.
What was that like, walking with your sister to school? I mean, she is old. What do you remember what went through your mind at all?
Well, I tell people I grew up in a large family as an only child because of the age difference. We didn't have too much in common. But the Second World War changed that because one of my sisters moved back home with a baby that was only 4 years difference from my age, and her husband was killed in World War II. So my mother and father raised that boy until he was a teenager. So that gave me a child in the household more my age.
So at the start of World War II, you were how old then? What'd you say?
5.
5 years old.
Yes.
So you were born in about, what,
37.
37.
1937,
okay.
Yes. And I guess because of that freedom of running all over, I mean, you knew everything that was going on. I mean,
were there any particular people who were in the town all the time that you met? The store, the shops?
The local business people that lived in town. Mm-hmm. Of course, the major employment center was Springfield Hospital. Most every family had some connection with Springfield State Hospital.
Yeah, tell us more about that.
And if you didn't, I mean, you went to Baltimore.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the employment center was Baltimore. Springfield State Hospital was a self-contained facility.
And really, as you mentioned earlier, you said that it really helped the town through the Depression.
Oh, absolutely.
And the war.
I mean, provided not only employment stability, but people don't realize, like I said before, that it was self-contained, and it hired everybody that was in maintenance, farming, because it was actually a working farm with chickens, a dairy, beef operation, hogs, and it employed everybody in those fields, plus supervisory capacity in each one of those breakdowns, and superintendent over the whole works, and the majority of those workers in that capacity lived on campus.
Including doctors.
The doctors lived there, the superintendent lived there, the farm managers lived there, and were active in the community, belonged to the organizations, attended church, their children went to the schools.
Were the schools on campus, or did they?
No, the school
they went to Sykesville.
The Sykesville school, which was elementary through the 12th grade. The individual elementary schools didn't come until much later, when Freedom Elementary was built out just past Eldersburg. The high school was a feeder school. They had a portable down in Oakland that the kids from Oakland went through the 4th grade, and after the 4th grade, they were bused to Sykesville to the 5th and 6th through the 12th grade.
Now you mentioned Oakland. Tell me a little bit. Oakland
is a town that no more exists.
Yes. Okay. Tell me a little bit about that town.
When Liberty Dam went in, Oakland was underwater.
Underwater. Okay.
That was a mill town. It was a woolen mill. Of course, the history goes back even before it was a woolen mill, but it was always a mill, and it was always a mill town. People that worked there lived in mill-owned town houses, and they had their store. I didn't even remember, but in reading some of the history, they had a bowling alley and a theater at one time there that was all owned by the Mill family.
Now, when did they start filling the Liberty Reservoir? What year?
1951 to 53, okay. Long in there.
So you actually visited that town in Oakland?
Oh, yes. It was the most direct way to Reisterstown. I mean, you went down and through Oakland Mills Road and came out over in Owings Mills.
Huh.
And of course, when that whole valley was flooded, Oakland Road, Bollinger Mill Road, sections of Deer Park Road, a lot of those roads had no destination anymore.
Yeah. So how many people lived in Oakland, do you think? It was a very
maybe a couple hundred, maybe.
Now, what did they do? Did people just move out en masse? People owned property there, right? And then they sold it?
Well, so some of it was owned and some of it belonged to the mill.
Okay.
So it was all incorporated in their work.
Right.
They were provided housing.
Okay. So that made it convenient actually to make it there too, because they had mainly one cellar, or pretty much so.
But with the eliminating of the mill, they had to find other employment.
Yeah.
And a lot of them that wanted to stay in that line went to the other mills, like in Ellicott City, they had a woolen mill. Milchester had a mill. And either that or they changed professions altogether.
Did they have any other mills in Carroll County besides that one?
Oh, there were a lot of the flour mills.
Oh, yeah, flour mills.
There was one right there on 32 just out of Sykesville, Herring's Mill, where the farmers brought their corn and grains in to be ground. When that mill closed, then we had the feed mill in Sykesville that put in a mill, and the farmers could bring their crop there to have it ground and made into feed. Before even Southern States, it was D&G and a private business, Harvey Cut Sale, at a farm home and service where the Southern States is now, and provided that service.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about the train, the impact of the train on Sykesville.
That was a big change because, especially with freight, something that we talk about the way train. Well, people that don't know anything about railroads don't know what a way train is. That's a train that comes a couple times a week, and they had a sideline into the businesses in Sykesville, and your freight came in by railroad car, and it was usually in the evening, and they would drop those cars off there on that side track and come back and pick them up a couple days later after the businesses unloaded them. And of course, the passenger train was discontinued in 1949. The telegraph office was closed in the late middle 50s. And of course, the diesel electric, when the steam engines were taken off, there was a water tower in Gaither. And if a steam engine stopped in Gaither to take on water, it usually blocked about 3 intersections of roads across the railroad tracks.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And
now Gaither, what's?
Gaither is the next town up the line between Sykesville. You have Gaither, then you have plane number 4, which was another railroad stop, and then you have Mount Airy.
Okay.
As you continue up from Baltimore.
Now, was Gaither in Carroll County then, too?
Gaither is just like Sykesville, right on the line of,
really?
of Howard
Is it
and
still
Carroll
there?
County.
Or
Yes, it is.
It is. Now, see, I didn't know that.
About the only thing that's active is a little Methodist church.
Ah.
But the community is still there. But at one time they had a grocery store, and the telegraph office was there for the railroad, plus the water tank that the steam engines refilled.
Now, what road is Gaither on? What road goes through Gaither? Or
It's just Gaither Road. It's
Gaither Road
it's
itself.
Just
okay.
a county road.
All
yeah.
right. Okay.
Yes.
Now, do you remember steam engines?
Oh, absolutely.
Tell me about your feelings about that as a kid.
I guess the laying in bed at night, especially during bad weather, I mean, you would hear them chugging up the track because it's a right good grade from Ellicott City up to Sykesville and on beyond. Mm-hmm. And if the tracks were wet or slippery, they would lose traction, and of course you would hear that noise of the wheels grinding down, and then the engine chugging from the start all over again. And a lot of times they would be loaded too heavy, and you would know the signals where they would call for a pusher engine to come out from Baltimore to help them get over the hump.
Is that right?
And very interesting time. I mean, when I was a kid, we would, if you heard the train coming, you would always jump on your bicycle and head for the train station, and the engineer would tip his hat to you as he went by, and the on the last car on the caboose, the flagman would always either wave his light or lantern, and
did they dress a certain way, or was it pretty much?
Oh yeah, they had their attire, the striped cap and the denim jackets, and then I guess the something that's not done much is they would strap torpedoes to the track, and that would alert the train that a slower train was ahead. When the engine would go over them, they would explode, and you would hear them. It would sound like a port of a shotgun.
I never heard of that. But,
yes.
So,
and
is it because so you didn't cause an accident or something?
That's right. Yeah, the engineer would know that there was a train
coming,
and of course there was a code. If they would put them so far apart, and it was like a Morse code. I mean, ever so many explosions meant that so much time had lapsed since the last train went through.
Huh.
And
Now you had a
He has a story, I don't know if he would tell it about, he took a ride on a train one day.
oh, that's
Go ahead,
It's,
go
it's
ahead.
comical
well.
now.
I always watched the hobos, and I
Sure,
wondered what
sure.
it would be
Yeah, I was
like
gonna ask you about that.
to
Yeah.
hop a train.
Yeah, I still want
Well,
to do that.
I was in Gaither walking, and one was stopped taking on water. It was stopped.
Yeah.
So I got on. I thought that I would jump off when
How,
it got
how
to
old were you?
Sykesville.
About
Well, you don't realize the grade, how much speed that train had picked up by the time
oh
that
yeah,
it was going through Sykesville.
right.
And when I looked down at that track disappearing under my feet, I was a little leery of jumping. And by the time I did get up nerve enough to jump, I was further away from home than I was if I'd have walked down the tracks from Gaither.
Oh boy.
And I had cinders embedded in my legs and knees and arms. And
Oh, you rolled probably. Just,
yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
just like in the
Yeah.
movies. Well,
Yeah.
how old were you?
Probably about 12, 14.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I think any kid would like to do that. I mean, it's my dream yet to do that.
Yes, you're right.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's an experience.
Sure. And did they have any of these? You know, see the movies. These tough guys on work for a railroad that would come after you or anything like that, or did you feel that was there? Or
No,
no, you didn't have anything
no,
like that. Yeah.
no.
So it was pretty. It wasn't a bad thing really to do that. You did that. I mean,
No, it was just
take a ride. Yeah.
just a childhood experience.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
So did a lot of people work for the railroad actually, or was that just that it came into Sykesville?
No, there were workers on the railroad to maintain the tracks. Woodbine, there were several families there that the men worked for the railroad. Not too many in the Sykesville. The telegraph operator lived in Sykesville. We had a state road shop was in Sykesville that had about 3 or 4 crews that were local that worked out of Sykesville, but not so awful many connected with the railroad. If they did, they worked out of Baltimore, not out of Sykesville per se. My father's brother left the farm as a teenager and went to work at B&O in Baltimore, and it was his lifelong job there working in the yard in Baltimore.
Yeah.
And that was interesting because as a teenager, he took me down there and showed me all the ins and outs of the cars being built, the engines being built, and how the switchers worked to line up the cars on the railroad to go out and come in, and it was very interesting.
Did the river play a part at all in Sykesville in any way? When you were?
Not so awful much, only as a swimming hole for the local teenagers.
Tell me a little bit about the swimming. Do kids swim in there today?
No.
No. And
We had a swimming hole called the Rocks. It was actually up the railroad tracks from the town itself. And it happened to be just a whirlpool area where the water gathered and was the deepest area. And it had rocks that you could dive off of, and it wasn't a very large area. The main reason for that is because the water is so shallow. You can't do any boating or anything because of the rocks and the shallowness of the water.
and what's that called? That's
Patapsco.
Patapsco. Okay.
Yes. Patapsco has many branches in Carroll County. North Branch, South Branch.
And this one is
This is the South Branch.
South
The
Branch.
North Branch is what is now encompassed in the Liberty Lake.
oh, okay.
And North Branch and Snowden's Creek and of course all your little creeks from the watershed that feed into that area.
So the main feed for Liberty Dam is the Patapsco then, or was it?
Yes, the North Branch.
North Branch.
Plus all the little
Oh, little
tributaries.
ones, yeah.
That,
Cave down in there.
yeah, that, right.
Oh, yeah.
If you're familiar with the watershed in Carroll County, I mean, with the way the water flows the different directions, everything winds up in the Chesapeake Bay.
Right. Right.
Yeah. But
Well, tell me a little bit about the town of Sykesville when you were growing up. Move a little farther ahead. What was the weekend like? What was Friday night like? What was Saturday night
Oh,
like?
the weekends was big time. I mean, Friday and Saturday nights. Sundays was usually quiet because the stores were all closed on account of the blue laws.
Mm-hmm.
But the only activity was the morning church services on Sunday. But Friday night, Saturday night was big business for trade, and which is all gone now because all the local businesses have closed up. There's a long, long list of businesses that were in Sykesville.
And they closed. They didn't close up all at one time, but just gradually kind of faded
Just
away.
gradually just phased out.
Mm-hmm.
They were either family businesses that no longer were doing enough business for for the times,
Mm-hmm.
and there was no one to take them over. And when I was thinking about this, when you think about business in Sykesville, from the high school, which is on Central Avenue, up in the more residential area of town, to the railroad tracks at the other end of Main Street, at one time there were 6 full-service gas stations. Now, there's one station that's still there that's been closed up for about 3 months, or 4 months maybe. But the other gas station is out on the bypass, Sandusky Road and the 32 bypass. No gas station in town anymore.
At all. Oh, yeah.
We had a full-service hardware store that was actually even International Harvester dealer, which International pulled that franchise in the middle 50s, and the hardware store itself closed up in the, I guess, late 70s, early 80s, and now it's just a great big antique store.
Uh-huh.
We had a Five and Dime. We had 2 clothing stores with men's, children's, ladies' clothing.
Do you remember some of the people's names and some of the names of the stores?
Yes, Miss Margaret Harris had the clothing store on Main Street that was later bought out by a gentleman by the name of Lissy from Baltimore after she no longer held the business. Cross and Rosensteel had a small department store where it had a little bit of everything along the lines of hardware and clothing. We had a drugstore with a food counter and soda fountain, a pool hall, several barber shops, a beauty salon, Wilbur Wimmer's Plumbing operated off of Main Street.
Who was
We
the?
had 3 grocery stores, the post office, and something that would surprise a lot of people. At one time, there was 3 cab companies that operated off of Main Street in Sykesville.
Cab companies in Sykesville.
Absolutely.
Now
Two
how many
companies.
blocks would you say? How big is the town? Describe the size of it.
1 mile from the, I guess, south hospital gate to the railroad track.
And you had 3 cab companies.
3 cab companies.
This is when you were what? How all the time?
Up until in the 60s.
Is that?
Well, I guess it dwindled down to 1. But Carl Harrison had a single cab. A gentleman by the name of Harry Dwyer had 2 cabs at one time.
Huh.
And then we had a family named Umbaugh who had the original company, and his son came back from World War II disabled with his legs all shot up, and he took over his father's cab business, and that built up to 3 cabs at one time.
I'll be darned.
And that cab company also connected with the bus line that ran through Westminster to Eldersburg to Baltimore, and you could buy a ticket from Sykesville, and that would allow you a cab ride to the to Eldersburg to board the bus, and
Huh.
that's that's another thing. The bus service.
So,
Blue Ridge Bus Lines
uh-huh.
ran 4 round trips a day from Westminster and Frederick to Baltimore to the Greyhound bus terminal on Howard Street.
Oh, okay.
And on visiting days to Springfield State Hospital on Sundays and on Wednesdays, they put on extra buses just to come to the hospital. And that could be 1 bus, 2 buses, 3 buses, depending on how many visitors that came out to the hospital.
Did you have the train was never a passenger train, was it? Or was that?
What was that?
Was the train a passenger train?
Till 1949.
Till 1949. Okay.
Yes. In 1940, I can just barely remember.
Uh-huh.
1949, it was just morning and evening, just a 1 round trip.
To what, Baltimore?
To Baltimore.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
You didn't go farther the other way then, huh? Or
Not that I know of. Well, I mean, it came down the line from Hagerstown.
oh,
and
it did.
on
Okay.
beyond. Yes.
All right. Okay. Uh-huh.
Yes.
What line
But
was that? What was the railroad?
B&O,
B&O,
Baltimore
okay.
and Ohio,
All right.
which is now the Chessie system.
Right.
Yes. But like I said, the Blue Ridge bus line, there was one line, one service on Sundays and Wednesdays that not only stopped at Springfield Hospital, but went on to Emmitsburg to Mount St. Mary's.
Ah.
So you had a lot of Catholic nuns that were always rode the bus, that visited patients at Mount St. Mary's or were at the college. And my brother-in-law happened to drive for Blue Ridge for many years. And
What's his name now?
Wagner,
Wagner.
right. He was born and raised here in Westminster, George Wagner. When he went out, when the bus line was bought out by Greyhound and it didn't do enough business for Greyhound to maintain it, he opened a gas station here in Sykesville, or in Westminster, I'm sorry, which originally was Weimert's on Main Street in Westminster.
Now, where was that?
Well, it's a Shell station now, I believe, but it was Esso.
Oh.
And man with the name of
Right on
Weimert.
Main Street, or
On Main Street.
Oh, where Tevco is now. Huh? It would be.
I thought it was Shell.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
On
Close. Name some. Was it next to the theater? That area.
yeah, but the theater would be
Yeah,
across, diagonal across the
Right.
street.
Yeah.
From the
Yeah, it might be Shell, but I think.
yeah,
Yeah, Tevco. Okay.
yeah. But the
Okay.
and getting back to Sykesville, we had a movie theater, a bowling alley, and I think I said the drugstore, and then the post office was in town, which is no longer in town. They have just a satellite post office there, but this post office now is out in Eldersburg.
Tell me about the bowling alley. I bet people don't know how pins were set up. Tell me how.
By hand.
Yeah. How
You had a
they
pin boy.
Yeah, you had a pin boy.
I never did that. A lot of the kids in town
That was a job.
earned their money. They would get like maybe 10 cents a game or something like that for setting up pins. And that was real big because in the 50s, you could hardly get a lane because of the leagues. And if you got to be a pin boy for league night, I mean, they picked up a right good bit of pocket change.
Yeah.
And,
Did you have duck pin bowling then as well as the other, or
it was just duck pins.
duck pins?
Right. Sykesville never had a 10-pin bowling lane. They do now out in Eldersburg, but it was always duck pins in Sykesville.
That could be a dangerous job once in a while too. Didn't they kind of have to watch out for that ball coming?
When the pins fly.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, right.
Actually, the building where the bowling alley was, my father was instituted in building that building after, I don't know just exactly what the date was, but he had a Ford dealership there that he lost during the Depression. And the man with the name of Hurt that bought the building and converted it into a bowling alley. I said the man must have been building a jail when he built that building because unless you know the original construction, it was a two-story building, and the shop part was actually on the second floor. And that's the reason why it had to be built so strong, because you had a concrete ramp to drive up like you do in the in-car parking garages now to get up to the service area.
And your dad helped build that?
Well, it was built for him the Ford
dealership.
He had a Ford dealership, but it actually wasn't his dealership. He was like a sub-dealer from Mr. Ed Butler in Mount Airy.
Okay.
The main dealership was in Mount Airy, which still no longer exists. I mean,
now the building does that building still?
It's still there.
Where is that in Sykesville?
It's on Main Street.
What's in there now? Is there?
It's actually closed up. It's been many things. It's been a restaurant. It's been a furniture store. It's been a knick-knack shop.
Now, tell me a little bit where that is. What do you remember the address or something? So just what does it look like?
It's right about in the middle. It's just across from Church Street. It'd be diagonally across from St. Paul's United Methodist Church.
Okay.
Next to Howe's Insurance Agency, which was one of the converted gas stations. Where Howe's Insurance Agency was Sinclair gas station and ice house. Back in the days of when we had ice boxes, Joe Cutsale had a big ice business out of Sykesville.
Tell me a little bit about that.
With home delivery.
Is that right? Yeah.
Which is another thing that I could talk a lot about. Home deliveries
Do that,
no longer exist.
Yeah.
I mean, like I say, Mr. Cutsale had hired an employee to drive around town and deliver block ice. There was a lot of other things that were delivered house to house. Quality Laundry, which is here in was here in Westminster, had home service out into the rural areas of the county, and you would send your laundry or dry cleaning early in the week, and it would come back in the middle of the week. Crystal Laundry out of Frederick picked up laundry house to house. You had Kuntz's Creamery, house-to-house delivery. Willow Farms Dairy, which is here just above Westminster, had a big delivery business down in southern Carroll County. Rice's Bakery out of Baltimore had house-to-house pastry and bread delivery.
That must have been a living, Hank. I mean, you could just have it instead of going and
that's the reason why my mother could be just a housewife.
Yeah.
I mean, she had no need to go anywhere.
Right.
My dad did the grocery shopping, and we had Mr. Bridenstine in Barrett was our Watkins dealer. He brought all the flavorings and all the things that Watkins sold, salves and like over-the-counter medications. And
I remember Jewel Tea. Was that
Jewel Tea? Yes, came by.
Yeah.
Yes, Jewel Tea.
Fish?
We had the fishmonger came on Fridays, and still did up until the late '60s, but they didn't come into Sykesville. We had one that stopped at the gas station in Eldersburg, and you could get fresh fish. You knew that they were still swimming yesterday. But the coal delivery, we had Morrow Company in Sykesville that stocked a little bit of coal, and Stem and Winfield stocked a little bit of coal, but you had to go get it yourself and buy a bag. But we had a couple of young men from Shamokin, Pennsylvania, that used to come down and would deliver a couple ton or at a time, and that's kind of a thing of past.
Well, you had doctors visit you too, I imagine, huh? You had
There was one doctor in town, Dr. Barnes, and one in Eldersburg, William Lawson, and Dr. Martin down across the Baltimore County line. And the doctors performed more in the office than they do now. Actually, you could get bones set. Dr. Lawson had a fluoroscope. He could x-ray for a broken bone and set it and put you in a cast like mine is here now, which I had to go to a center to get it done. They did minor surgery. My father was in an accident and his false teeth buckled and cut his lip, and Dr. Lawson sewed it up. I jumped in a swimming pool and cut 3 toes off.
Oh.
And my brother rushed me to Dr. Lawson, and he sewed them back on.
No kidding. See, now, you wouldn't think they'd do that back then. You think now
Yes.
they'd do it, but actually,
but
they're
actually,
so back
that's how the times have changed.
Is that
The
right?
doctors.
But I mean, the fact that they even sewed them on, that's kind of...
That's right.
Yeah,
But,
and they work all right, huh?
the tips of them are numb, but they work.
Good.
Like the doctors did just a whole lot more, and they did house calls too. I mean, they had privileges in the hospital. And that's another thing. In talking about hospitals, there was no such thing as Carroll County Hospital, which has been a blessing to our area because if you had any major problem, you had to go to Baltimore or to Frederick or Sandy Springs in Montgomery County.
Okay.
But Sandy Springs was, I guess, considered just a hole-in-the-wall hospital. I mean, it was just about like Carroll County was when it started. If you went there on an emergency, you had to prearrange for a doctor to meet you and stuff like that. And Sykesville had no emergency ambulance service until 1953, and surprisingly, the Weir and Haight Funeral Home bought an ambulance and operated it for a couple of years to prove the need. And then in 1957, the fire department bought its first ambulance, furnished them
That's
by...
pretty late. How did you get along before that? Just drive?
You had to drive yourself.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh my.
Yeah.
You had a relationship, the doctors had a relationship with Springfield Hospital Center. Tell them about that.
No, that might be confidential. No, with the close knit of the hospital, and it's working with the community. A lot of times, if you had Dr. Barnes didn't have any X-ray facilities. I went there with a broken ankle, and he sent me over to Springfield, and the radiologist at Springfield X-rayed my ankle. And gave him the photo, and I took it back to him, and then he set my ankle.
Which wasn't normal. It wasn't a normal procedure, but you
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's another interaction with Springfield
Sure.
State Hospital. They had the biggest auditorium in the area. Our high school couldn't even hold its own graduations or any of our activities. We used the auditorium at Springfield State Hospital. And on Saturday mornings, they showed movies to the patients. And the kids would go over there, and as long as you sat all the way in the back, you could see current running movies.
So you'd watch movies with the patients
for free.
Sure. Yeah.
If you could hear the movie over the rants and raves and the clapping and the stomping of the feet of the mentally ill.
Yeah, right. I'll be darned.
And the local ball teams used the ball stadium at Springfield, which is no longer in existence. They had nice dugouts, a very good maintained ball field, and the Penguin Club that originated in Sykesville right after the war for a man by the name of Mercer started it for the young men coming home from the service to get involved and have something to do.
Tell me a little more about that. What was it?
Well, it became
It was baseball.
a baseball league, and they played in they had a Central Maryland league that the communities that had these ball teams would play. I never got too much involved in it myself, but it provided something for those fellows to do, and they did it up until just a few years ago. I mean, some of them were 60 years old and still playing ball. My brother-in-law played with a league in Baltimore, and they came out and played. The fire department in Sykesville even had a softball league. All activities that happened right after the war and were instituted that every little community had that no longer exist. Now, I guess it kind of migrated into your little league and your pony league and all that exists now. Only it was for adults.
Get back to Carroll Hospital. What was it like when it first opened? Was it where it is now?
Yes.
And it was
just a low, looked more like resembled an elementary school rather than a hospital. No resemblance to what it is now.
Yeah, right.
I mean,
and your school now. I'm going to jump a little bit. Your school too. Now, where was that located? In Sykesville, or
on Central Avenue, right outside of the south gate for Springfield Hospital.
Okay. And how many? What was the enrollment of like you said, it was pretty big for the school. How many?
Well, it was only like I hate to quote figures, but I would say
generally.
Maybe 300-400 altogether in the from first. See, there was no kindergarten. It was first through 12.
All right.
And it was the same style that all the schools in the county were. It was tri-level. You had a basement with your shop and cafeteria in the basement, and then you had your elementary school on the first floor and your high school on the top floor, and you always looked forward to going upstairs because you knew that you would be in high school.
I don't think a lot of people knew that they were divided like that exactly.
Yeah,
I never thought of it.
You had all 6 grades
Yeah.
on the first level, and then your 7th to the 12th, well, only to the 11th grade until 1949.
Did they have any one-room schoolhouses around Sykesville at all? Or?
Yes. Well, they were mostly portables, and they were 2 rooms. They were divided in half.
Portables then?
Yes.
Is that amazing?
We even had one in Sykesville. And the school in Oakland was a portable. And that is one that's in the
like
county.
A trailer then? Or?
No. It was they called them portables because it was a prefab building. It was brought in and put up. And that building is still there being used by the Bureau of Water Supply. Almost, identical to, maybe they changed the windows.
The one in Oakland?
The one in Oakland.
Oh.
Yes, is being used by the Bureau of Water Supply as offices in Oakland.
Huh.
But I don't think that there's any other like that building that exist. The one that was at Sykesville was torn down in the middle 50s when they expanded. First they built an elementary school, one level elementary school, a good distance from the high school. And then later they came and added a gymnasium and cafeteria and connected the 2 buildings. And and then that completely changed the school made the main entrance off of what is Buttercup Road rather than Springfield Avenue. And then, of course, the fire happened in 1958, I think.
Tell me about the fire.
Which burned the main building, the original building, down. And that was one hot fire.
Did you witness it?
Yes. I heard the sirens go off in the middle of the night, and
so you had been like 15, maybe, or what?
Oh no, I had graduated.
Oh, graduated. Okay.
Yeah, I was.
Well, that's right, 37. Right?
Yeah, I was married and had one child.
Right. Okay, yeah.
Because
right.
I got married in 1957, and
who'd you marry?
Married to Nancy Hilton. I was a registered nurse. She went to Sinai School of Nursing, and she was a Montgomery County girl, farm girl. Married her. We had 3 children. We were married for 39 years, and she passed away.
Oh, I see.
And I actually lived in Montgomery County for from 1960 to 89.
And who are you married to now?
I am married to Margaret, my wife of going on 11 years,
Mm-hmm.
and we live in Eldersburg.
And she's from?
Well, she's from Baltimore City,
Mm-hmm.
but she moved out here in Howard County in the late 60s, early 70s. And she is also a registered nurse. And her last employment was at the Central Laundry Camp in Sykesville as the nurse for the prisoners there.
That's a whole story in itself.
Indeed,
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah.
That's another hidden thing of the town. There's a lot of people that don't know that that facility's there. She gets some shocking. Well, she did when she was working. She says, "I worked at the prison in Sykesville," and then they prison in Sykesville, and
Where was that? Was that on the Springfield grounds?
yes, it was off a part of the Springfield grounds. It was built originally as a laundry camp, and still is an operating laundry camp to do the laundry for all the state institutions. And it was introduced to the area to be a low-profile facility. They wouldn't have any dangerous convicts or anything there.
Mm-hmm.
They would be minimum, security operation, but that is long gone.
Well, there are some current issues with that too, or isn't there some current issues on the
Well,
grounds there?
that hasn't to do with the prisoners. This has to do with another building that they want to bring a different
Clientele or demographic. Yeah.
Right, a different demographic of
Right.
mental illness.
Right.
I mean,
Let's go back to your school. What was it like? Did you know the senior high school kids when you were in school? How was that?
absolutely. They were your mentors. I
They,
mean,
now they were your mentors. They didn't tease you. They were your, I mean.
oh, absolutely not. No.
Yeah.
No.
Tell me about that, mentors.
Well, you figure that maybe the biggest class was maybe 39 to maybe 49 people,
Uh-huh.
and you had your sports teams, which you idolized.
Uh-huh.
I mean, and I was never a sport myself. I tried it. I wasn't any good, so I didn't pursue it.
Yeah.
But the furthest I got was timekeeper in basketball, and followed our team around through our intramural sports through the county. But I guess your sports, I was more active in the music. I participated in the choral groups and the Estedford that was held here in Westminster.
The what?
The Estedford.
Oh, tell me about that.
Where all the county choral groups get together. And
Estedford. How's that spelled?
I feel like I'm back in school. I don't think it's called that anymore.
Uh-huh.
But it was one of the things that when there was more schools
Uh-huh.
in the county than there is now.
And you all got
Before
together.
the consolidation,
Mm-hmm.
you had the state band that each school sent delegates out of their bands to play in the state band, and they would put on a performance. And you also had the choral groups from the different schools that had maybe their special presentation, and then you would do an operetta as a full group.
Oh, wow.
The one that I can remember right now is we did the Mikada. Was one of was the main for the whole group to do.
Now, do you still sing?
Yes, in church.
In church, where you do sing? You're in the choir or whatever?
Yes, and I sing solos. And
Oh, you do? Wow.
My children sing, and my daughter's organist in our church, plus she sings.
Now, what church is that?
I go to a small church over in Montgomery County that I went to where my late wife and I were married. It's called Mount Tabor, United Methodist Church.
Okay. Now let's get back to school again. Tell me some of what your day was like in a school like that. The seniors, I suppose, stayed up there, but they came down to mentor you, or?
Yeah, well, they came down to eat in the cafeteria.
Oh, okay. So you ate? You didn't go home from school to eat?
I
or?
did.
Oh, you did
because I was a walker.
Okay.
I lived just 1 block from the school.
Oh, right, right.
Now, in nasty weather, my mother would give me 26 cents, and I could buy a plate lunch and a pint of milk.
26 cents.
26 cents. You could get a plate lunch and a pint of milk for 26 cents.
And that was probably cooked right there too. I imagine.
Absolutely, yes. The cooked right there in the cafeteria. The 3 ladies that worked there in the cafeteria were there for an eternity. I mean,
Do you remember their names at all? It's probably pretty
yeah.
hard because you're.
Yeah, I was going to say Ms. Day, who lived right in town, but I can't. I know Mrs. O'Donnell, and later there was Mrs. Samuel Richardson worked in the cafeteria. That's about it. Yeah. But it was a whole lot different than it is now. I mean, you had the higher grades were assigned work duties in the cafeteria to clean off trays. Some would be assigned to sell ice cream. Some would sell the extra, if you wanted to buy extra milk.
Right.
You had high school students that usually manned those.
Tell me a little bit about your father had the Exxon station on 32 and 26. Is that correct?
Yes, it was Esso then.
Esso then, right?
Esso.
And you worked there, and your father first had the Ford dealership,
in Sykesville.
In Sykesville, and then he moved out there. And where are those pictures? Do you happen to have those? We have a short time left, but I'd like to. I did this once with other, and I think the first picture is really very interesting because people would recognize that corner. You know, look at that corner today, and I don't know if we can. Can we put that up there a little bit? Can you see it? Can't see it? Not at all. Okay, because I did that with one picture on one other. It was a bigger picture, so I thought. Okay, you can hold it. Go ahead. Maybe you can focus on that then. All right, that's good. Can you get that?
What are we looking at here?
This is. Go ahead. What this?
This is the first station. It was a combination like a gas and go, and restaurant and apartments. That was torn down in 1940.
It's on Route 30.
Route 32 and Route 26.
Where the Exxon station is now.
Yeah, the current Exxon is a gas and go and convenience store.
And tell them what is the car and the vehicle there now? Is that?
It's a 39 Chevrolet.
Show a couple more of those pictures because I think they're historical in what they have. Your father coming home from the First World War, and the store. Was this in Sykesville now?
No, this is in Floraville. It's at the intersection of Freedom Avenue and Route 32. It's Trayer's store. There's a Citgo station and convenience store there now. It's on the opposite corner from the fire department. The Sykesville Fire Department moved out to that state property.
And your father is on the right here.
Yes.
On the right, and the gentleman who's with him?
Andrew Brandenburg, who picked him up when he was discharged from World War I.
Okay, so that's some time ago then, for sure.
Absolutely.
And you had another interesting picture in there too. That I thought. This is the station, one of the stations later, than in the same place.
Yeah, this is the configuration of the stations that were built in the late 40s, clean up until the 70s, this configuration of multiple bays and office, all the oil companies used this design for stations.
Mm-hmm. Oh, good. Now, you worked for quite a few years with your father. Is that correct? Or
Well, actually, my father retired the year I graduated from high school.
okay.
I worked part-time for my father while I was going to high school.
While you're going to high school.
But after I graduated from high school, my brother and a partner, Windsor Burdett, bought my father out of the business, not the property, but just the business.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked for them for 17 years.
Okay.
And in 1971, I left Eldersburg working and went to work for Montgomery County Equipment Division. Mm-hmm. And that's where I retired from in 1989.
Mm-hmm. Now, look at your list, and we have about 5 minutes left. Look at your list that you have. You've got wonderful thoughts in there. See if you can see something that was really important to you that you would want to, you don't want to wake up 3 o'clock in the morning that you missed. So.
Fairfield Farm.
Yeah, I guess Fairhaven Farm, which is now Episcopal Ministries Home for the Aged, was another almost like Springfield Hospital. Before farming was mechanized, that large farm employed about 13 families, and they lived in housing provided by Mr. John Z. Baseman, who owned the Fairhaven Farms. They had complete farming operation. They had a dairy where they had a Guernsey herd and a Holstein herd, which were hand milked there on the premises. Mm-hmm. They had a dairy where the milk was pasteurized. Mr. Francis Stem drove the refrigerated truck that hauled the milk to Baltimore, and I understand that most of their milk went to the hospitals in Baltimore. It was very little of it was sold in the community, and that's the reason why their bottles are very collectible items. If you have a milk bottle with Fairhaven Farms on it, it's very collectible.
Oh. Uh-huh.
And a lot of those houses were torn down when it was no longer a working farm, and when the Episcopal Ministries bought it, because there was no use for them. And when the farming operation was phased out, they were rental properties controlled by the estate of Mr. John Z. Baseman. Okay. The majority of the property has been annexed by Sykesville and is now wall-to-wall houses. The Episcopal Ministries has a large part of it, and the Alzheimer's unit is out on Obrecht Road, which borders another novel area, the copper mine that used to be there on that property.
That's a whole nother story.
Yes, it is.
Let me say, I think we're going to have to close right here. But
Yeah.
Mr. Gardner, Ed, what's your whole name?
George Edward Gardner.
George Edward Gardner, and you
Yes.
go by Ed, pretty
Yes,
much. Uh-huh.
pretty much.
And
Yeah.
how old are you now?
71.
71. Well,
Yes.
thank you very much, and for your Mrs. Gardner here giving you a few kicks here on what you should say.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. I
Thanks.
enjoyed it.